Peter, thank you very much indeed. You'll just need your postcode for the constituency surgery. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd begin on an equally rainy day. On the 30th of June 1997, after the 99-year lease on the new territories came to an end, Great Britain handed back Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. At the stroke of midnight, the Union Jack was lowered to the strains of God Save the Queen. The Hong Kong police ripped the royal insignia from their uniforms, and Red Army troops poured over the border. There, that's better. There was another cloudy day. Steaming out of Victoria Harbour as the Royal Marines played Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory on the last symbolic voyage of the Royal Yacht Britannia, Britain's last governor, former Conservative Party chairman Chris Patten, wrote, "That night we were leaving one of the greatest cities in the world, a Chinese city that was now part of China, a colony now returned to its mighty motherland in rather different shape to that which it had become Britain's responsibility a century and a half before." In London, the atmosphere was altogether shriller. The handover of Hong Kong to China strikes many Westerners as a disgrace and a tragedy, thundered The Economist. Never before has Britain passed a colony directly to a communist regime that does not even pretend to respect conventional democratic values. A few brave commentators suggested there might be a more complex prehistory to this handover. Instead of self-regard and imperial nostalgia, the journalist Andrew Marr thought this final colonial retreat should have been a moment for a new British identity to emerge. So enough last posts and folded Union Jacks, he wrote, enough Britannia, enough wary self-deprecation. We should not leave Hong Kong with too much regret. But there was no such nuance from Britain's politicians. The diaries of Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's Director of Communications, described the scene amongst the UK delegation preparing for the ceremonial. When someone referred to the Chinese as the Dewhursts of Peking, there was a mild laugh around the table. I looked at Chris Patten, a bit bemused. Dewhursts as in butchers, he said. Campbell thought it all self-indulgent, but when he caught sight of the Chinese soldiers, he was hit, as he put it, by the full awfulness of the handover. Then the flag came down and theirs went up, and it was all pretty sick. Tony Blair hated it, and it showed. I can't believe that we could not have kept it. In his own memoirs, Blair recalls of the ceremony a tug not of regret, but of nostalgia for the old British Empire. He also admits to a startling failure to appreciate the historic significance of the return of Hong Kong as a rising, newly prosperous China sought to take its place in the world and shed the memory of its century of humiliation. And there's a lovely account, actually, of Blair as a new prime minister, jet-lagged, flying over to Hong Kong, only to be met by the Chinese premier, who thought he would have some fun with the UK prime minister about his knowledge of Shakespeare, which was not as extensive as it might have been. But there was one member of the British delegation keener to cling on to the past. In a confidential diary entry entitled The Great Chinese Takeaway, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales laid bare his despair at seeing the Crown colony returned to the mainland. Watching another piece fall from his family inheritance, the Prince lamented the ridiculous rigmarole of meeting the old waxworks, Yang Zemin, and the horror of watching an awful Soviet-style ceremony in which Chinese soldiers goose-step onto the stage and haul down the Union Jack. And it's so heartening the Prince of Wales no longer makes gaffes like that. Charles, Philip, Arthur, George, Mountbatten, Windsor knew all too well that when his time came to assume the throne, the loss of Hong Kong meant Britain's imperial role would be long past. Such is the end of empire, I sighed to myself. But if the British Empire has indeed come to an end, its legacies remain nonetheless apparent. And the most compelling of these phenomena still with us is the chain of former colonial cities dotted across the globe, from Dublin to Mumbai, Melbourne to New Delhi. After sporting pastimes and the English language, to which might be added Anglicanism, the parliamentary system, common law, urbanism is, in the words of Jan Morris, arguably the most lasting of the British imperial legacies. And this imperial heritage is now being preserved and restored at a remarkable rate as post-colonial nations debate the virtues and vices, the legacies and burdens of the British past, and how they should relate to it today. As a historian with a background in urban history, I was intrigued by taking some of the tools I had developed in my work on Victorian civic pride and beginning to apply them to the work of imperial history. And my ambition was to marry up a history of the idea of empire with the history of the city. So my new book seeks to explore the imperial story through the urban form. 10 cities charting the rise and fall of the British Empire, charting the changing character of British imperialism through the architecture, the civic institutions, the street names, the fortifications, the material culture. The history of these cities also exposes how understandings, how the idea of empire changed across time and space. As English and then British imperial ambitions developed from the late 16th century, so the rationale for empire also evolved. At times, Britain was a mercantilist empire. At other times, a free trading empire. In certain periods, Britain was involved in a process of promoting Western civilization. At other times, in protecting multicultural relativism. For a good period prior to the 1807 abolition of the trade in slaves, Britain regarded itself as an empire of righteous exploitation, and then afterwards, an empire of liberty. As Joseph Conrad's Marlowe notes in his brilliant novel of colonial realism, Heart of Darkness, it was always an idea of empire that had to redeem the practice of empire at any one point. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. The ambition of this book was then to explain how these ideologies of empire, these ideas of empire, were made flesh in the urban form, how the shifted justifications of empire made their way into the fabric of the colonial city. Because the other ambition of this work is to move our debate about the imperial past on from some of the narrow binary definitions we've seen grow up in recent years. Famously, in his 2003 book, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, the historian Neil Ferguson made a stirring and influential case for the British Empire as the handmaiden of globalization and as a force for progress. No other organization, he wrote, has done more to promote the free movement of goods, capital, and labor than the British Empire in the 19th and early 20th century. By way of contrast, an increasing body of opinion has sought to cast British imperialism as a very, very bad thing. In the context of political opposition to perceived American imperialism at the turn of the 21st century, discussion about the British Empire, particularly on the left, has often been reduced to tales of slavery, starvation, and extermination, loot, land, and labor. In the words of the author Richard Gott, the rulers of the British Empire will one day be perceived to rank with the dictators of the 20th century as the authors of crimes against humanity on an infamous scale. And much of Gott's case has received official endorsement in recent years, with a series of public apologies by European governments. In 2004, Germany apologized for the massacre of 65,000 Herero peoples in what is now Namibia. In 2008, Italy announced it was to pay reparations for its colonization of Libya. Then in 2013, the United Kingdom government, having already apologized for the Great Famine and expressed regret for the trade in slaves, was forced by a High Court judgment to announce a £20 million compensation package for 5,228 Kenyan victims of British abuse during the 1950s emergency or Mau Mau rebellion. But the danger, I think, is that as the legacy of empire moves into the realm of official apologies, lawsuits and compensation settlements, the space for detached historical judgment has narrowed. What is more, as Linda Colley has suggested, one of the reasons why we all need to stop approaching empire in simple good or bad thing terms and instead think intelligently and inquiringly about its many and intrinsic paradoxes is that versions of the phenomenon are still with us. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's this very complexity of the urban past, of the history of the imperial city, which allows us to go beyond the good and bad cul-de-sac of so much imperial debate. The history of colonialism covered in this study suggests a more diffuse process of exchange, adaptation, and interaction, which also shaped our urban world as much as it shaped the cities of the British Empire. So, what do the history of these cities reveal? My story begins on the eastern seaboard of America, where in the mid-17th century, a band of Puritan merchants and settlers sought to leave the fallen, collapsing Catholic Stuart England and build a new England, a new settlement, a city on the hill, as Governor Winthrop famously called it. And they named their new city Boston, after the town in Lincolnshire. And here you can see, I think, probably not, but what I love about this map is a sense, and there you can see Boston right in the middle with just the connection to it, is the islets and the islands, all now built over in terms of modern Boston and infilled. But then such a difficult place in many ways to navigate, but full of such riches in terms of its cod fisheries. To begin with, this was a godly citadel, and this is a wonderful picture by Paul Revere, the great engraver. And you can see on the one hand the masts of all the chapels and the churches, and of course Boston was about the freedom of religion. You could be a Congregationalist, you could be a Unitarian, you couldn't be a Quaker. That was too far. But you've got the masts of the churches and chapels, and then you've got the masts of the ships. These are actually the British ships coming in, and then Long Wharf coming out. To begin with, Boston was a godly citadel. To begin with, Boston was about the Puritan faith. But over the course of the late 16 and then 1700s, Boston becomes part of a transatlantic empire of goods. The British Empire in the 1700s in the Atlantic is about commerce and trade, a vibrant trade in cod, in whale oil, in silverware, in tea, in cotton, in coffee, in ceramics from Stoke-on-Trent. The world of London and Manchester, Birmingham was also part of the world of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. They shared the same plays and newspapers and cultures. They also shared sometimes the politics. There was a cultural Anglicanism across the pond, and it was supported by a war economy. When you look at the culture of Boston in the 1740s and 1750s, this was as loyal, royal a city you could hope for. And what they made their money out of were the rolling wars of the 18th century, the provisioning of those conflicts as the British fought the French. And they enjoyed the victories, but they didn't like paying for them. And so when the British Parliament started to suggest that there might be some taxation to pay for their military protection, well, then things began to get a bit sticky. The British began by trying to impose taxes on sugar. They then imposed taxes, the Stamp Act, which was taxes on publications. And here, wonderfully, you've got an entrepreneur in Derby selling teapots over to the Atlantic seaboard, campaigning against the Stamp Act. There's always money to be made out of ceramics, let me tell you that. And then, most foolishly of all, the British Parliament came for tea. And that's one thing you don't want to upset the British with. what you had with the first empire in America and what you had with Boston was this remarkable divergence which turns Boston from this very loyal royal city in the 1750s into this citadel of revolution in the 1770s. And here we have a depiction famously of the Boston Tea Party, where they turn Boston Harbor into this cascade of tea leaves. They think the Boston Tea Party was about no taxation without representation. We know it was about them trying to keep their smuggling business going. Either way, the Boston Tea Party and what happened afterwards marks the end of the first empire. The 13 colonies would remove themselves from the British Empire. And this culture of trade, of cultural Anglicanism, would be interrupted for a while, but it would resume its commercial status. So I begin in Boston. I then think about what goes with tea, and that's, of course, sugar. And my second city of empire is Bridgetown, Barbados. The history of the British in the West Indies is a salutary and harsh reminder of the raw brutality, oppression, and racism involved in so much of the colonial project. The British became involved in sugar production from the late 1600s using techniques developed by the Dutch and the Brazilians. And in Barbados, it's really begun most famously by the Drax family. And the Drax family still have a house in Barbados. And Richard Drax is the Member of Parliament for Dorset South. But he's not personally involved in this trade anymore. I've yet to reveal to him that I've actually sort of crept round the compound of his house in Barbados. What you see here is a depiction of the sugar industry at work. And in the top right, you can see them crushing the canes through vertical rollers. And then in the middle, in the hut, the boiling down of the cane juice. And obviously the overseer with the gun. In time, what you've got there is a mechanical production. In time, it would be windmills which would provide the energy for the crushing of the cane. And of course, these weren't the English settlers carrying out this work, and nor could they get indigenous Amerindians to do so. So instead, between 1662 and 1807, British ships carried 3.25 million Africans across the Atlantic to America and the Caribbean. And they landed, more often than not, in Bridgetown, Barbados, because Bridgetown, Barbados was the most easterly of the ports in the Caribbean. This was a stopping off point, a market town for the trade in slaves. And from there, they would go to the other islands, but in Barbados, they turned a landmass similar in size to the Isle of Wight into one of the richest islands in the world. The whole is a sweet spot of earth, not a span hardly uncultivated with sugar canes. All sides bend with an easy declivity to the sea and is evergreen, is what John Atkins, a surgeon in the Royal Navy, thought of the island. The island was almost entirely given over to cane, with some 93% of its total exports made up of sugar, rum, and molasses. And it was exported out of Bridgetown. And here you see this beautiful depiction of Bridgetown and Carlisle Bay, with the ships lined up in Carlisle Bay, some of those slavers coming over from Africa, and then some of them completing the triangular trade by going back to Europe. And we've got the governor making his way to church in an afternoon not unlike the one we're seeing today. So Bridgetown is where the slaves came in and the sugar went out. And the profits from that bloody enterprise flowed across the Atlantic. And why I was so keen to have Bridgetown there is when we think then of the growth of the British Empire and the infrastructure of empire and then the growth of Britain, the profits from slavery, the profits from sugar were essential for funding the army, the navy, and then back here in Britain, the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. Where does that initial capital come from for Liverpool, for Bristol, for Manchester, for Birmingham? So much of it bound up with the history of the slave trade. The riches of the Caribbean were fundamental to the expansion of British colonialism. From Boston to Bridgetown, I then complete this Atlantic part of the empire with a look at what is regarded in some senses as England's earliest colony, Dublin in Ireland. From the plantations of the late 16th century, the English and the Scottish had settled the lands, and as such, they became part of the Irish nation. These settlers and their descendants, the so-called Protestant ascendancy, turned Dublin during the 18th century into a colonial city, into a city which was an expression of a colonial imperial identity. The Protestant ascendancy, as English-born in Ireland, as they put it, wanted to be equal partners in empire, not troublesome colonial cousins. This is Leinster House, the seat of the Duke of Leinster, now the seat of the Irish Parliament. It was designed by a German architect, Richard Castles. It became, in many senses, the model for the White House back in America. And it was part of this Palladian colonial world in Dublin. We don't often think, I don't think, of Dublin as a colonial city. But they certainly did in the 1960s when nationalist politicians were beginning to smash the Georgian terraces and the squares and the fabric of what they regarded as the British Georgian past. Georgian buildings are an offence to all true blue Irishmen, wrote a letter writer to the Irish Times in the 1960s. They are a hangover from a repressive past, and they must go. And that was the ideology behind the ripping balls smashing through so much of that beautiful civic fabric. The architecture, though, of Dublin in the 1700s was a testament to a desire to build a sense of Britishness. And the importance of Dublin in my story is the importance of the codification of an idea of Britishness in the 18th century before Britain then goes back out to the world. And as we approach the referendum in Scotland, it's sort of well to reflect in some senses on the origins of these identities. Just look, for example, at Custom House, designed by James Gandon. The theme of the Custom House is the union of empire, representing, quotes, the friendly union of Britannia and Hibernia with good consequences relating to Ireland. And you can see on the right the ships, the trade of empire coming in, and then on the seashell in the middle is Britannia and Hibernia cuddling up. And they cuddled up even closer with the 1801 Act of Union, bringing Britain and Ireland together. And in the aftermath of that, Dublin really embraces a more obvious sort of bullish British imperial identity. This, in the middle, is Nelson's column. The IRA always had their eye on Nelson's column. And as you can imagine, in an independent Ireland, this wasn't going to last long. And there was a wonderful correspondence in the 1950s between the IRA Dublin Brigade and Dublin City Council, where they basically said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. It's coming down, are you going to do it or are we going to do it? And they did it in 1966. I move from the Atlantic thousands of miles south because I want to swing to the east. I want to show the movement of the British Empire from the Atlantic Ocean out towards the Indian Ocean and out towards India. And central to that progression was Cape Town, the brothel and tavern of the two oceans, as it was known, or more generously, the master link of connection between the Western and Eastern world. The capture and control of Cape Town was fundamental to growing the global power of the Royal Navy and, crucially, securing India for the British. This was the seaport and provisioning station for the swing to the east. This was a Dutch town in its origins. It was the provisioning station for all those East India men sailing out from Holland towards the East Indies, and desperate to avoid scurvy, desperate to keep their sailors healthy, they would stop around the Cape of Good Hope. They would stop in Cape Town and begin to get the lemons, the oranges, the fresh water to recoup themselves. And so you can see in the architecture the beautiful straight lines, the gardens, the whitewashed sort of low-rise buildings, some of the Dutch aesthetic that the British would inherit. You can also see the gallows, hopefully just in the middle. Jemima Kindersley, visiting in the 1780s, wrote, "Everyone must be pleased with the town, which has all the regularity and neatness usual among the Dutch. The streets are all parallel to each other, and there is one large square with trees planted round and a canal of water from springs running down. The houses are very good and have a neat appearance on the outside, which altogether make it a very pretty town, and some few circumstances excepted, equal in neatness to any of our seaports in Dublin. With its Table Mountain, cascading clouds and roaring seas, there was always a romance about Cape Town." And here's the romance, the Table Mountain. And then, of course, the tablecloth coming over the top. But it was fine while the Dutch held Cape Town, because this was almost a free port where any number of navies could stop and provision. But when revolutionary France in the 1790s invaded Holland, immediately the British Imperial officials began to think that the Dutch colonies would be next on the list. And as one Royal Navy official put it, "What was a feather in the hands of Holland will become a sword in the hands of France." If Britain was to secure its trade routes and military routes to India, it had to have Cape Town. And so in the late 1790s and then again in the early 1800s, we fought to capture Cape Town and hold on to it as a British colony. I think, though, the wonder of Cape Town is always the layer upon layer of different histories and identities in that city. It is a city that looks as much out to the world as it does to the interior of Africa. So what was the prize which Cape Town was so determined to protect? It was the richest, wealthiest, most magnificent city of the British Empire in the late 18th, early 19th century. A city built upon the export of the cotton and silk of Bengal. It was, of course, the capital of British India. It was Calcutta. "Nothing could equal the magnificence of my approach to this town," a visitor wrote in the 1800s. "For nearly 3 miles, the river, which is as large as the Thames at London, is bordered by lovely, well-built country houses with porticos and colonnades. The town is a mass of suburb palaces in the same style, with the finest fortress in the world." To the Victorian imagination, Calcutta would come to symbolize the black hole of Calcutta, this place of terrible damage to the British imperial project. But what Calcutta symbolized was both the riches of empire and the extraction of extraordinary wealth from Bengal by the British, but also the move in terms of the idea of empire to a vision of a territorial landmass, a much more Roman sense of what the British Empire should be about. And this is codified by one man, who is the Governor General of India, Richard Wellesley, the brother of the Duke of Wellington. His philosophy was always clear. He was determined, as he put it, for India to be ruled from a palace, not from a counting house. Building on the actions of Clive of India, of Warren Hastings, what Wellesley wanted to do was to expand the landmass of the British and India, and to build up an empire worthy of its Roman predecessors. Just as the world was coming to appreciate Edward Gibbons's work on the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, on the banks of the Hooghly, Wellesley was building up his own imperial edifice. And here you see Government House, which is now the Raj Bhavan, which is now the capital seat of West Bengal. But there you have all the Roman ambition of Wellesley and a sense of a Roman empire. A huge number of houses were ripped down to build a house modelled on Kedleston Hall, the historic seat of the Curzons in Derbyshire. And this was about codifying the broader ambitions of empire. But I think it's also important to stress some elements of the relativism that British rule in Bengal in the late 1700s, early 1800s developed in terms of the Sanskrit, in terms of the literature, in terms of the printing. Many of some of the first fruits of the Bengal Renaissance came with a much more progressive approach to indigenous cultures in India that you wouldn't see later in the British Empire, but you did see under Wellesley in Calcutta in the early 1800s. But the main export from Calcutta, where the real riches flowed, was from the poppy fields, was the opium trade, coming out of Calcutta and then heading further east to my next city. What Calcutta took from the poppy fields, the opium drug, crept, as one missionary put it, in a most mysterious and fascinating manner into the homes of the rich and the poor, with its mystic fingers gripped the hearts of old and young. Men became paralyzed before this new force, the opium drug, and reason stood silent, and the highest ideals of humanity slowly paled and vanished in the presence of this Indian mystery. The most lucrative market for the export of opium was China, and the way into China was through the fragrant harbor of Hong Kong. And here in this beautiful early depiction, we see the go-downs, we see the warehouses, and also the residence of the company really driving this, Jardine Matheson. The Opium Wars and the capture of Hong Kong was about securing the Chinese market for the export of opium. Behind the raw materialism of this was the language of free trade, of laissez-faire, of open markets, of Britain's great gift to the world, of the Manchester School. But it was the determination to open up China which put the money and the finance and the soldiers into place. And soon enough, Hong Kong grew as one of the great ports of the world. And part of the attraction, which I think you can see here, of Hong Kong for the British was the drama of the site, the granite rocks, the oceans, but then also the greenery. And when you read accounts of people's first interaction with Hong Kong, it's Hong Kong as Scotland, it's Hong Kong as the Highlands, it's the rain, it's the clouds, it's the humidity, and then some sense of the familiarity of it. It grows and grows, and here we see the harbour between Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, busier and busier as a free trading port. Junks, American whalers, tea clippers, paddle steamers, gunboats. By the end of the 19th century, over 11,000 ships entered and cleared it every year, carrying over 13 million tons of cargo. Hong Kong would become the empire's third port after London and Liverpool. The Indian connection for Jardine Matheson was Sir Jamsetji Jejeebhoy, who was a great merchant and trader, and he was one of a number of hugely powerful figures from my next city, which is the opposite of Bombay, which is the opposite of Hong Kong in terms of its sort of pristine beauty. It's the first industrial city, I think, of the British Empire. It begins its life as the island of the good life, and it ends with accounts in the 1860s and 1870s of it not dissimilar to Birmingham. Bombay, of course. Bombay's great break in world history is the American Civil War, because suddenly cotton is no longer being exported out of the American South because of the blockades. The European markets need a new supply, and it's the cotton fields of the Bombay Presidency which begin to supply the cotton market. And then they begin to make their own. And as an industrial city, as a mid-19th century city, its architecture begins to feel more like Birmingham, less like classical Rome. And here you have the municipal buildings on the left, and you have the Victoria terminus on the right. Great heroic buildings, a celebration of infrastructure, of industry, of trade, of commerce, in an architecture which becomes known as Bombay Gothic, which is this remarkable mix of Indo-Saracenic designs. The sort of modernists would hate it in the mid-20th century, but it proved enormously popular in the mid-19th century. Obviously, you can only understand this by understanding Stoke-on-Trent. In the midst of Crawford Market, which goes on fire a lot, is this wonderful fountain. And its designer, it's a very Ruskinian naturalistic fountain. And its designer is a man called John Lockwood Kipling. John Lockwood Kipling learnt his art at the Burslem School of Art before he went out to teach in Bombay. And he he proposed to his wife, Alice, on the shores of a North Staffordshire beauty spot called Lake Rudyard. And he liked that name. So when his first son was born in the grounds of the Bombay School of Art, he thought he'd name him Rudyard Kipling. So we think Bombay is much more to Burslem than it does to other parts of the world. I will move to my remaining cities. From Bombay, I go to Melbourne. And Melbourne is my first suburban city. A different architecture took hold here. Nearly everybody who can lives in the suburbs, explained one visitor. It is strange that the Australian townsman should have so thoroughly inherited the English love of living as far as possible from the scene of his business and work during the day. And what you have in Melbourne is as crazy and wonderful a celebration of suburban design as you do in the great suburbs of London and Birmingham, Manchester in the late 19th century. And what this shared architectural taste spoke to was the broader theme in terms of the history of empire which Melbourne highlights. A belief, as Chamberlain put it, in a crimson thread of kinship. A belief in a shared imperial racial identity. Melbourne and the colony of Victoria conceived of itself as part of a greater Britain, whose blood loyalties flowed out from the British Isles all the way to the Bass Strait. In the urban centres of the white colonies, in South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, a conception of empire as a partnership between Anglo-Saxon tribes separated by oceans developed. Separated by oceans, but crucially connected by race. And part of that connection was developed and explored through sport. And you begin to get, beginning with the tours in the 1860s, of these great clashes between the England and colony teams. And everything that Norman Tebbit tried to sort of argue in the 1990s about a cricket test was really being explored in Australia in the 1880s as a debate about which team you should support. And And you have these great sort of explorations of Britishness in an Australian context, that they had lost none of their Englishness by living out south. So one of the newspapers wrote, "For all that the sceptre has passed away, so to speak, the flag is struck," talking of the Australian team. "It may console them to note that the English race is not degenerating, and that in the distant land and on turf where lately the blackfellow hurled his boomerang, a generation has arisen which can play the best bowlers of the time." And of course this would culminate in the Ashes. But the language of sportsmanship, of racial identity, segued into a martial spirit when the call for World War I came. And you do have this terrible sort of elision of sporting metaphor and martial demands. And this poem that was read in lots of Melbourne schools about a team that is ready to take the field to bowling with balls of lead in a test match grim where if one appealed, the umpire might answer dead. And we know the remarkable level of sacrifice that would demand in terms of the First World War of so many young men from Melbourne, from Victoria, from Australia. My penultimate city of empire is sort of epically magnificent. New Delhi. And this is how one critic described it in the 1930s. "The Rome of Hindustan lies on a scorched and windswept plain, historied with tumble-down memorials of the Mohammedan conquerors. Across this plain glitters now an English Delhi, a vision of domes and towers, pink and cream against the morning blue and new green trees below." Indeed, some critics could barely do justice to the monumentality of what they saw. Dome, tower, tower, dome, red, pink, green and white, washed gold and flashing in the morning sun. The traveller loses a breath, and with it his apprehensions and preconceptions. Here is something not merely worthy, but whose like has never been. And this was the purpose of Lutyens and Herbert Baker's design of New Delhi. This wasn't just an architecture where East meets West, and it is an architecture of East and West. And Lutyens was scathing about Bombay Gothic. He was scathing about indigenous Indian architectural traditions. And yet, when you look at all the Mughal elements within the Secretariat, when you look at his gardens, he couldn't not but introduce those features. But what Lutyens and Baker thought they were building was an architecture of empire, was an imperial architecture which would last for thousands of years. Like Wellesley's Calcutta, Lutyens' New Delhi was built for thousands and thousands of years, and famously the bells were made of stone so that they could never ring the death knell of empire. And obviously, to everyone else, this was just tremendous, remarkable hubris. So when Georges Pompidou, the French politician, visited its construction site in the 1920s, he wandered it gleefully, saying, this will be the greatest ruin of them all. But it wasn't a ruin. It was a remarkable piece of imperial architecture, a place of incredible ritual and hierarchy, and a place where almost naturally an independent India and the leaders of an independent India could feel comfortable to take over. My final city is a great, wonderful city, is a heroic city. It is the city of Liverpool. This is a city made by empire and then unmade by empire in the latter half of the 20th century. And what I wanted to do with my final city, having explored the growth and high point of empire, is also to explore the decline of the empire and how that affected, through the prism of a city, and how that affected the city of Liverpool. Liverpool is a city which traded to the ends of the earth. This was a city whose docks were like pyramids, whose peoples came from across the four corners, which made phenomenal money out of the African trade and then out of trade with West Africa. But it was also a city that when in the latter half of the 20th century empire began to unwind, it was hammered hard, more so, I think, than Glasgow, more so than London, the East End of London, because it was over-dependent upon empire, because it was a port economy and didn't diversify enough. It meant that when the end of empire came, it found itself in very, very difficult circumstances. And we can look at the troubles of the early 1980s as part of the story of deindustrialization, part of the story of politics, but we can also look at them as part of the story of the end of empire. But I end my book on a new empire. This is a mocked-up vision of Liverpool waters as imagined by the Peel Group. You can see in the middle right the Three Graces, and to the right of that, one of the worst buildings ever designed, but in front of it, the Museum of Liverpool. And then if you head up the coast, those skyscrapers don't exist. But that is the vision of the Liverpool for the future. That is the vision of Liverpool supported by the Peel Group of investors. And the money for that is Chinese money. And I end with a reflection on whether a new empire is shaping the fabric of an old colonial city and beginning to change and reimagine Liverpool as an imperial city, as a colonial city, and what the rise of a new empire will do for the future of Liverpool. Because I think across the former cities of the British Empire, one can trace the impact of the new rising powers. But crucially, one can also trace the end of empire here in the UK. As in Liverpool, so also in the city I'm proud to represent in Stoke-on-Trent. In the latter half of the 18th century, Josiah Wedgwood had been instrumental in commissioning the Trent and Mersey Canal to transport ceramic tableware from the potteries to the port of Liverpool, then out across the empire. And across the British Empire, you can see the wonders of Spode and Minton and Dalton in the most far-flung of colonial compounds. The booming pot banks of Stoke-on-Trent supplied ceramics of the empire right up until the 1960s. And then in the post-war decades, the impact of empire returned to Stoke-on-Trent in the form of extensive migration from Pakistan and India, but the lucrative business of imperial production collapsed. The protected markets of the Commonwealth were thrown open to global competition, and as with the cotton mills of Manchester and the port of Liverpool, the relative decline of the pottery industry in Stoke-on-Trent is also connected to the end of empire. Only a generation ago, the social and economic foundations of so many of our industrial cities were bound up with a colonial identity, which has now simply disappeared. So finally, this book traces how the rise and fall of empire has affected not only the history of former colonial cities, but also the story of our own urban past. For like Hong Kong, we too, ladies and gentlemen, still live in the shadow of empire. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy for 5 minutes to take reservations, objections, or orders for ceramic ware. I'm fine.
Thank you very much, Tristram. That was fascinating. And With your background in urban history, as you say, I wonder if you comment on an alternative view of history, in fact, from the Marxist view, which you've also, of course, studied through Engels. And that is, in fact, cities themselves as being key drivers of world history, not class, perhaps, but great world cities, such as the ones you've explored in this book. I'd be interested in your view of that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, cities are the sites for the export of production, for the in terms of the early years of colonialism, in terms of the years which Marx would call primitive accumulation, cities are the vehicles for the export of those riches back to the metropole. But they then begin to take on their own economic functions. And I think what's so interesting about the British Empire, particularly with the steamboat, the telegram, the railways, the might of the empire in the late 19th, earliest 20th century is very codified around some of these great industrial imperial cities. And I think now, when we think of the power of where power lies today, so much power today is also bound up in Shanghai, Dubai, London, Los Angeles, Mumbai, Sydney. And I do think that we worry sometimes about the decline of the nation state. Well, part of that is the rise of city-states again, and global city-states with extraordinary power, as I think we saw some in smaller manner, particularly in the Edwardian period, through the colonial city.
Could you just crystallise in what way you're suggesting a new approach to the evaluation of empire and the whole imperial endeavour in relation to sort of traditional left and right pre-existing interpretations?
My ambition is through the history and culture and fabric of the city, is to really build upon the works of scholars like John Darwin and others to explore some of the interactions and exchanges and adaptations involved in empire, rather than some of the binary black and white, good and bad stuff we've had. Because empires, unlike plantations, unlike other colonial forms, are much more adaptive environments. Yes, you're going to have, and you do have, exploitation, racism, the power structures of empire, but you also have resistance, exchange, adaptation. And whether you look at the Bengal Renaissance in Calcutta, when you look at the history of the free-coloured community in Bridgetown, I think the city allows the city allows the space for a more complicated understanding of empire than we've seen in some other works. Hopefully. I think.
To what extent do you see the rise of risk of insularity in terms of relationships with Europe on one side, and if Scotland goes for the yes vote, insularity there as well, as itself a consequence of the end of empire? So an increasingly smaller UK state.
I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, wouldn't it be desperate if we find ourselves in 2018, as it were, England, not Great Britain, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, we don't know what the structures would be, but not Scotland, and then also outside of the European Union. And to go from, as it were, where we were in 1970, 1980, to where we would be in 2018 would be absolutely devastating. But that, I mean, I don't want to get party political. You've had enough of that over the last 48 hours. But there is a strand of thinking which would be very happy for England, as it were, to be Hong Kong or Singapore, which would be a sort of free trading, open port, city-state, somewhere off the edge of Europe, sort of rolled on the back of, Russian, Qatari, Dubai money, not part of Europe. And that's just not a vision I'm comfortable with. And I think part of exploring the history of empire is also, I'm very passionate about our future in and part of Europe, but we don't want to end up in that position. I don't think.
Tristram, can I?
Sure.
Sorry.
Yes.
I've got who's over there.
Yeah. Speak. Where are you?
Sorry, just it's one over here.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
So you did mention the triangular trade, and you
Yes.
mentioned some of the issues we've had over apologies and everything go with it. Of course, in 1807, as you say, we abolished the slave trade. The Royal Navy then spent another 40, 50 years actually trying to put that into some effect. But do we still owe more than just simply an apology?
I've looked at the campaign for Caribbean reparations, and I don't think a monetary transfer makes sense. I think much of what the campaign led by, I think it's Hilary Beckles, who's a brilliant scholar, argues for, is in terms of opportunities, in terms of education, in terms of dealing with development challenges in the West Indies, and I think we should be part of that, and we are part of that. I think we narrow. I think we often narrow debates when we get into the terrain of some of the apologies. I also think there's a sound philosophical objection to, as it were, the apologizing for what you're not responsible for, but that doesn't mean not appreciating the historical legacies and responsibilities, which I think we do, but we can certainly do more. But I think, as it were, here's an apology, we've cleared the deck, we're off, doesn't take you very far. But I think I probably have to stop in a minute, but one more?
Thank you very much. Would you be able to comment on your ability to write such a historical book balanced with your very heavy front bencher duties?
There we go. Let's end on some politics. I tell you, the thing about this book, it has taken so long. They built and dismantled the British Empire quicker than it took to write this book. This book has been going on before I was elected, before I was a front bencher, but you're absolutely right. The demands of dismantling Michael Gove's legacy is very, very arduous, and I shall be giving it all of my attention over the next 12 months.